Okay, first we're going to use this data to try to find out whether women are more likely than men in this data set to have their tickets dismissed by the judges whom we're looking at here. And then after we do that, we're going to go back and see whether there's a difference between from one judge to the next. I'll show you that in just a moment. But for starters, let's highlight all the data that we're going to use in the analysis. I'm just holding down my left mouse button here and dragging to highlight all the data. And then I'm going to click Insert and Pivot Table, and finally Pivot Table here from the little drop-down box. Okay, and this little dialog menu pops up, and the first thing it does is it asks me what range of data I want to work with. Notice that the range of data that I highlighted is already in here, so that's good. And then I'm just going to go ahead and accept the default here. It's going to put the pivot table that I create in a new worksheet. It's going to create another one of these things down here and put the results there. So that's just fine. If for some reason you want to put the results right next to your data set, you can choose existing worksheet and then click on whatever cell you want the pivot table to start in, and that'll work okay. But for now I'm going to just take the defaults and click OK. And when I do that, I get this little dialog box right here that opens up. It shows the three variables in the data that I'm working with, and then also some places over here that I can put them. If your dialog box looks different from this, what you can do is you can click this little drop-down box right here, and that gives you a range of different layouts that you can use. I'm using this second one from the top right here. Alright, so now I need to start putting stuff in places. Oh, by the way, you can move this around a little bit. I'm just hovering my mouse over this border right here until it turns to a double-sided arrow, and then I can move this back and forth. So if your dialog box happens to be covering up the table that you're working with and you want it out of the way, you can just grab that border and do this. I'm going to scrunch this up a little bit so I've got some real estate here to look at. Alright, so the first question is, which of these variables goes where in these boxes over here? And here's a little way to remember it. Think about which of these variables is the cause and which is the effect. In the relationship we're looking at, we're kind of assuming that gender causes having your ticket retired. Specifically, we think if you're a female, that causes you to be less likely to have your ticket required than if you're a male. So the cause is going to go in the column labels box. They both start with C. That's a way to remember. Cause, column. The result goes in the rows box. Result, rows. They both start with R. So I'm going to put gender, the cause, in the column labels box. The result in the rows box here. And whatever you put in the rows box also needs to go down here in the values box. In this case, again, the tickets retired. Alright, and as you can see, as I was doing that, Excel was building the pivot table right here. What we've learned so far is that there are 113 females who did not have their tickets retired, and 105 males who did not have their tickets retired. Meanwhile, there are 89 females who had their tickets retired, and 149 males, many more, who had their tickets retired. But to really get a look at what's going on here, we need to see the percentages, not the counts. The way to do that is you can put your cursor anywhere here in the pivot table, and if this pivot table field has disappeared, it'll come back. See that? There you go. It'll come back. And down here, where we have the count of tickets retired, just hit that little down pointing arrow to the right, choose Value Field Settings. Okay. And notice the default is to give you the counts, how many there are of each type, and they are shown as just normal, which is just the actual counts there. If we change that normal to, scrolling down a little bit, percent of column, then and click OK, then it changes those counts into percentages of the column. So there 41% of the males did not get their tickets retired versus 58%, and likewise with the females. Now here's how to read one of these things. If you set it up right with the cause in the columns box and the result in the rows box, and if you chose column percentages, then you always compare horizontally in the table. So you would compare this percentage with this one, or this percentage with this one. In the way I would read this box is like this. I would say, well, look here, 58, almost 59% of the males had their tickets retired versus only 44% of the women. So the women are less likely to have their tickets retired than the men. That looks like evidence of a bias. What I'd like to do next is see whether this pattern is the same for both of the judges in the data set. There's a nice easy way to do that. You don't do this for every analysis. Sometimes there isn't a third variable you want to consider, but if you want to, here's how you do it. I'm going to take the judge variable right here. Remember, this is the one that distinguishes whether the judge dealing with a case was Robinson or Carson. I'm going to put that judge variable over here in the report filter box. By the way I'm moving these is I'm just pointing at them with the mouse, holding down the left mouse button, and then dragging the variable to where I want to put it, and then letting up once it gets there. So when I did that, you'll notice that Excel added these two boxes up here. What I can do now is I have a drop-down arrow here. I can look at all the judges, both of them, which is what I'm doing right now, or I can look at only one judge at a time. Watch what happens when I do this. When I choose Carson and click OK, the percentages change, and what I'm looking at now are the percentages only for those traffic cases that were handled by Judge Carson. And here, in fact, the bias it either goes away or in fact reverses. Of the cases that come before Carson, 50%, about 51% of the males, in fact, if you round up, had their tickets dismissed, compared to 57, almost 58% of the females. So those percentages are pretty close. If anything, females are a little more likely than males to have their tickets dismissed in front of Judge Carson. Watch what happens when we look at Judge Robinson. Again, highlighting Robinson, clicking OK. So it looks like if you go up before Judge Robinson, 68% of the males have their tickets dismissed compared to only 28% rounding up of the females. So the bias that we see toward males in all ticket cases is really concentrated in those cases that come before Judge Robinson. So what we're doing here is we're using a filter variable to look at the two judges separately, or we can look at them together. So quite a bit of analysis you can do there with that pivot table.